The record book in the Las Piedras courthouse was a heavy, dust-choked thing, its pages browned and brittle at the edges, yet the entries for the Graves family looked as though they had been written yesterday. Each name flowed in the same deliberate hand. Smooth loops, measured strokes, not a single blot of ink. 12 children over 18 years, every one of them assigned a birth date that landed neatly between planting season and harvest, as if they had been scheduled with the same care a farmer gave to his crops. Each entry bore the father's name, Henry Graves, in a practiced signature that spoke of confidence and certainty, and beside it, Eleanor Graves' hand, small, precise, almost decorative, as though each letter had been drawn rather than written. In the margins, the county registrar had written the weight of the child, the hour of birth, and the address on the ridge. There was nothing in the pages to suggest anything unusual, yet it was that very neatness, that unwavering order that carried a kind of quiet unease. Outside those records, the children seemed to vanish. Neighbors could recall Eleanor's face behind the curtain or Henry's tall frame walking into town, but no one remembered the sound of children's laughter from the ridge, no scuffed boots by the porch rail, no small voices calling to each other in the yard. One woman swore she had seen a cradle once through a window when she visited to return a borrowed pan, but it was empty, covered in a clean white cloth as if waiting for something that had never arrived. Others would later admit they thought the Graves simply had bad luck, that each child had died before their first birthday and been buried quietly in the little family plot on the back acre. Yet no markers were ever seen there, no freshly turned soil, no flowers laid in mourning. In those years, Las Piedras was a place where grief was handled in silence, and the Graves family carried themselves with a calm so even it felt unnatural. Eleanor wore the same pale dresses, each spotless and pressed, her hair always pinned, her shoes free of dust despite the long dirt road that led to town. Henry spoke with the slow weight of a man who measured every word, never warm, never cold, just steady. They shook hands, they nodded at neighbors, they bought flour, candles, and soap, and they walked home with their goods balanced neatly in baskets. No one thought to ask where the children were. It was only in the courthouse under the dim oil lamps that the unease sharpened. There was something strange about how the births were documented. Every child's weight fell within the same narrow range as though their bodies were made to a specification. The times of birth were suspiciously consistent. Always in the early hours before dawn, never during the day. The handwriting did not age over the 18 years. Henry's signature on the first record was identical to the last, as if his hand had never trembled or tired. To the clerk who kept those records, it was remarkable enough to remember decades later. Though she admitted she had never said anything aloud at the time, rumors began in the smallest ways. A farmhand claimed he had seen Eleanor carrying a bundle into the house in the dead of night, holding it far from her body, her face set like stone. Another swore he had heard faint crying from the ridge while walking home late, only for the sound to cut off abruptly, leaving the night unnaturally still. But in the open daylight, no one could prove anything, and the Graves family gave no sign that the whispers reached them. Those who lived near the ridge described the house as one that kept the wind at bay. Even in the strongest storms, no shutter banged loose, no door creaked on its hinges. Curtains never stirred, not even when every other window in town rattled under the desert gusts. The air around it seemed to hold itself, waiting. People would glance up at it as they passed, but never linger. In the end, the names on paper became the only public trace of the Graves children. They were as close to existence as the county would ever officially grant them. Precise ink lines on a page in a room no one visited unless they had business. But for those who noticed, it was enough to plant the quiet dread that would grow over the years. that the ridge did not just hide a family but something else entirely, something that could pass itself off in perfect signatures and the false weight of official record, something that did not need to be seen to keep living. And while the rest of Las Piedras went about its days, the courthouse kept those pages safe, the ink as dark as the morning it was set down, the names as untouchable as the truth behind them. The Graves' home stood apart from the rest of Las Piedras, not in size or grandeur, but in the way it seemed to belong to no season. The wind that raked across the ridge bent the mesquite and sent grit whispering through every fence post in town, but it never seemed to touch the Graves' walls. Their windows were always drawn with thick curtains the color of dried bone, neither shifting nor fading under the sun. The porch boards gleamed with the polish of care that went beyond pride, as if someone had scrubbed them down not just to clean but to erase. The air surrounding the place felt heavy, not from the heat but from a kind of absence. The way silence can feel solid when it is absolute. Those who had stood close to the house spoke of an unnatural stillness, like the kind in a room where someone has just died. There was no sound of chairs scraping across the floor, no creak of footsteps, no rattle of dishes in the kitchen. Not even the faint hum of insects seemed willing to cross the threshold. It was as if the house had made some silent pact with the world outside, promising to let nothing in that did not already belong to it. Henry Graves would appear on the porch at exact intervals, the same hour each morning and each evening, to sweep a broom across boards that had no dust. He moved with a rhythm that suggested ritual, his gaze rarely lifting from the ground, as though looking too long into the distance might invite something unwanted. Eleanor was seen less often, her pale form sometimes silhouetted behind the curtains, standing still for long stretches, her face turned not toward the view but toward the walls within. Inside, those few who had been allowed across the threshold described a space stripped of the ordinary chaos of living. Every object had its place, and no two pieces of furniture ever changed position. The floors were bare and waxed to a dull glow. The scent was faintly metallic, clean in a way that felt almost medicinal. Even in the kitchen, where warmth might have softened the air, the shelves were arranged in an exactness that made visitors uneasy. Jars spaced evenly, labels facing forward, no sign of use beyond the fact they existed. Dust somehow never seemed to settle. One visitor claimed that even when he traced his finger along a high shelf, it came away clean, as though the air itself refused to let particles rest. It was in this stillness that something unseen seemed to breathe. The Graves' home was not lifeless. It was waiting. Each object felt deliberate, as though chosen for a purpose that was not beauty or comfort. The rugs that covered parts of the floor had no wear in their fibers, their colors muted and symmetrical, their patterns repeating in perfect order. Chairs were positioned in ways that seemed to direct rather than invite. The walls held no pictures, no signs of family moments, yet in the absence of decoration, the rooms did not feel empty. They felt observed. Those who stayed long enough claimed they began to sense a faint vibration beneath the quiet, as though the house carried its own pulse, slow and measured. There was no sound to it, only the awareness of being in the presence of something that was listening without ears. The calm was not soothing. It was the kind of calm that follows after a command has been obeyed. Children in town dared to climb the ridge and stand at the porch rail, but few did it more than once. They said the silence pressed against their skin, making it hard to breathe, as if the air inside the boundaries of the property belonged to someone else entirely. At night, from a distance, the house was a black shape against the sky, its windows sealed against the moonlight. No lamplight leaked through the curtains, no voices rose from within. The people of Las Piedras would pass it on their way home, keeping their eyes forward. They would tell themselves it was only a house, and yet each knew that if something were to happen inside it, a scream, a cry, a crash, it might not reach the ears of anyone beyond its walls. And in that certainty, the grave's home held its greatest power. It drew no sound and it gave none back. A place where whatever lived inside could do its work uninterrupted, unseen, and unchallenged. Ruth Holloway had delivered nearly every child born in Las Piedras for 3 decades. Her hands were steady even in her old age, her voice calm in the hours when labor turned desperate. She kept a thick leather-bound ledger in which she recorded every birth she attended. Names, dates, weights, the condition of the child, and sometimes a few personal notes. Most entries were straightforward. Healthy girl, good lungs, small boy. Trouble breathing at first, but strong cry after an hour. But among the hundreds of names, there were 12 that carried an unease she could never shake. 12 that belonged to the Graves family. Next to each of those, in the narrow space of the margin, she had drawn a small, strange symbol. The mark was nothing obvious. A looping curve intersected by a short line, almost like a stylized hook. She never used it for any other family. When asked about it years later, Ruth would only say it meant unfinished, before falling silent, her eyes turning distant as though recalling something she wished she could erase. She had been young when she delivered the first Graves child. Eleanor had insisted on no other women present, not even her own mother, and Henry had kept to the hallway, his boots pacing slow, measured paths. The birth itself had been easy. Too easy. The child slipped into the world with no cry, no tremor, its tiny eyes half open, not with the clouded glaze of a newborn, but with a fixed, unsettling stillness. Ruth remembered holding her breath as she checked for signs of life. The skin was warm, the chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. But the mouth remained closed. Eleanor had not seemed concerned. She took the child into her arms, her pale hands cradling its head, and she whispered something Ruth could not hear. When Ruth asked if she should attempt to coax a cry, Eleanor's voice was firm but gentle. No, not yet. That not yet would stay with her for years. Each subsequent delivery at the Graves house carried the same strangeness. The children were always born in the hours before dawn, always under lamplight that felt too dim for the work at hand. There was no rush, no urgency in the parents' manner, only an eerie calm. The infants were eerily similar in weight, within an ounce or two of each other, as if their growth had been regulated with precision. None of them wailed at birth. Their breathing was shallow but steady, their tiny fists clenched, their faces almost serene. Eleanor never asked for Ruth's help to nurse them, never requested the usual postnatal care. She would dismiss her as soon as the umbilical cord was tied, pressing coins into her palm with thanks that felt rehearsed. The ledger's symbol was born of Ruth's own unease, a way to mark something she could not bring herself to write plainly. In her mind, unfinished meant more than premature. It meant that the life she had just brought into the world was not complete in the way all other children were. It was as if something had been held back, deliberately kept from crossing some unseen threshold into full humanity. She never spoke these thoughts aloud, not even to her closest confidants. In a small town, a midwife's word could ruin reputations, and she was not willing to bring that kind of trouble on herself. Still, she could not stop marking each Graves entry with the same looping hook, her private signal to herself that she had seen something beyond the ordinary. On her last visit to the ridge, Ruth was already old, her hands beginning to tremble with age. The delivery went exactly as the others had, calm, silent, unhurried. But when she placed the child in Eleanor's arms, she noticed something she had never seen before, a faint pattern on the infant's skin just under the jawline, almost like a shallow spiral pressed into the flesh. It faded when she blinked, and for a moment she wondered if her eyes had betrayed her. Yet when she looked at Eleanor, the woman's gaze was fixed on her with quiet intensity, as if daring her to comment. Ruth said nothing. She tied the cord, gathered her things, and left. That night she made her final entry in the ledger. She drew the symbol with greater care than ever before, pressing the nib hard enough to leave an indentation in the paper. She closed the book and did not open it again for many years. When she eventually passed it on to her niece, she gave no explanation for the marks, only a warning. "If you see that sign, you'll know to keep your distance." The niece, curious and unsettled, would later say that when she ran her finger over those pages, the paper in the grave's entries felt different. Smoother, almost polished, as if the ink had sealed the surface. And so the ledger remained, its symbols quietly holding the truth that no one else in Las Piedras was willing to see. Outside its pages, the grave's children were names on paper, ghosts in the memory of a woman who had once thought her work was to bring life into the world, never suspecting that some lives might be made for something else entirely. The hook-shaped marks were her only rebellion, the only way she could admit to herself that whatever she had helped deliver on that ridge was not meant for the life the rest of them knew. Abel Kincaid climbed the ridge with a carpenter's calm and the simple hope that hard work could quiet the mind. And Henry Graves met him at the door with measurements that read more like rules than a plan. Each line written with that same patient hand the town already feared to name. And the first rule was that the upstairs room would admit no daylight, the second that the door must sit so flush it shared a seam with the wall, and the third that no angle in that space would meet another, for corners were to be erased, rounded, softened until the room felt like the inside of a held breath. And Abel, who had framed schoolhouses and barns and kitchens where people laughed over stew, felt that small, unsteady place inside his ribs when a job asks for things a house does not want to give. Yet he nodded and said he could do it if the wood was sound and the nails were true. He carried lath and steam-bent ribs of pine up the narrow stairs and marked a circle in charcoal on the floorboards. Then another inside it, and he began to raise the curve, small pieces fastened in careful layers, each rib coaxed into a bow with damp heat so the plaster would take, and the house did not settle or creak, it only watched. Or that is how it felt to Abel as he worked, his scraper whispering in slow arcs while the hallway stayed empty except for the soft pass of Eleanor's shoes, as she moved like a ghost with a clean rag in one hand, wiping what did not need wiping. And when she paused in the doorway, she said in a low voice that the room was for a nervous relative prone to fits, a person who could not tolerate edges, and Abel grunted that he understood the world had people like that, though he had never met one. And he went back to smoothing the curve until his arm ached and the air tasted like wet lime and metal. On the second day, he bent the ceiling into a shallow dome and troweled skim over mesh until the seams vanished, and every sweep of the blade left a skin so featureless it refused to hold a shadow. And with each pass, the air seemed heavier, not hotter, just thick in a way that made breathing a choice. The way a man chooses to wade deeper into a pond at dusk even though he cannot see the bottom. He told himself it was the steam and the dust, but the feeling rose when he stood still, not when he worked, which is how a room tells you it has begun to think. And Abel did not like a thinking room. He trimmed the door into a long, gentle bow so it would kiss the frame without a gap, and he planed the latch edge until a slip of paper would not pass, and Henry stood with one palm on the plaster as if to feel for wind that was not there, and he said with that mild tone that sits wrong in the gut that tight is good, tight is safe, and Abel said nothing because money had been counted into a cloth pouch before he even set his horses. And Eleanor stepped close to the hinges and wiped them again, and Abel could smell the faint lemon of oil and the clean that always lived in this house like a law. By afternoon, the floor met the walls in a wide cove, and the corners no longer existed. There was only flow, only bend. And when Abel stood in the center, he understood the trick in his bones. With no edges to catch the eye, the room had no place to stop. So sight and thought went on circling, and the body wanted a corner the way a hand wants a tool, a place to anchor, and there was none. And that is when his hands began to tremble, small at first. Not a shake so much as a hum in the bones that made the trowel leave a faint ripple he had to chase. And the more he tried to correct the surface, the more it seemed to breathe back at him. A slow swell and ease like a sleeper under a thin sheet. And he pressed his palm to it and felt warmth where there should have been cold plaster. And he pulled his hand away and told himself the lime was curing fast in the heat. A simple craft fact. Nothing more. Toward evening, Henry asked him to stand in the doorway and listen. And Abel did. And he heard what he thought was silence until he realized it had a shape. Not a sound, but a pressure that gathered where corners should have been. The way wind gathers behind a barn. And he imagined air trying to rest and finding no place to settle. And he did not like imagining a thing like air going tired. So he said the room would be done by morning if left to set overnight, and Henry agreed with a nod that felt like a verdict. And Eleanor touched the wall with the back of her fingers as if greeting a feverless child. Abel came before dawn to burnish the final coat, and the house was dark except for the lamp he carried, and every curve threw the light back without mercy so the room glowed evenly. No shadows, no relief, and he understood then that a man who could not see a shadow could not judge distance or depth, and that too was a kind of trap, one that did not need bars, and the tremble in his hands returned harder, and his heart picked up a nervous skip. And he thought of the names in the courthouse book that he had heard carpenters whisper about when they drank, and he thought of a cradle seen behind a curtain with a cloth laid smooth across it, and he thought of the way a place can hold breath for someone else, and he lifted his trowel and could not make himself touch the wall again. He wiped the blade clean, set it in his chest, walked downstairs, left the pouch of coins on the hall table without counting, and told Henry he had been called to another job, which was a lie he was willing to carry. And as he stepped out, he felt the door pull shut behind him with a soft, perfect seal, like a lid finding its seat. And the sound followed him down the ridge the way a memory follows a man who knows he has built something he should not have. And in town he said only that the room was round and patient and made to keep noise from leaving. And no one asked what it was meant to keep inside. Eleanor Graves began the night work the way other women set a table, with quiet hands and a mind that counted. She carried 2 covered pails from the back gate to the kitchen where the lamp burned low and the clock face was wrapped to keep the tick from leaking. When she lifted the lids, a pale steam rose that smelled not of food but of linen and coins, a thin metallic sweetness that clung to the tongue. She measured by scratches inside the tin and stirred until the surface turned clear and thick as if it were learning to hold itself. The house listened. You could feel it in the way the flame steadied when it should have flickered, in the way the ladle never knocked the side of the pot. Henry wiped the porch boards over and over as if polishing a boundary and waited for the sound that never came. Eleanor skimmed the foam, pinched away anything that dared to cloud the shine, and poured the mixture into the pails again, capping them tight, pressing the wire down with a folded cloth so no metal squeal would rise. She moved without waste. The back stairs took her to the round room where corners had been erased, and at the threshold she paused with her hand on the latch the way a nurse rests her fingers on a sleeping wrist. The door gave without a click, and the hush inside pressed against her face like a cool palm. She fed the quiet like one feeds a sleeping child, not with a bowl but with a path. Along the cove where the wall met the floor ran a shallow channel so smooth a drop could travel it without breaking shape. Eleanor poured in a slow circle until the liquid traced the whole room and joined itself, a thin river that trembled once and went still. In that stillness something answered without sound, a pressure that rose like heat off stone at dusk. The surface shivered, then cooled, and under that cooling the house seemed to take a breath and keep it. What the liquid carried was no recipe taught in town. Pieces were bought in separate places so no clerk could guess the whole. Condensed milk from the rail shop, glycerin from the apothecary, sugar, bone meal, gelatin sheets, and a clear oil meant for lamps. In a small parcel lay powder the color of ash that came by post from a man who signed only with initials. Eleanor boiled and strained and skimmed until it turned thin and shining. She called it the draught. It was food only in the way a wick is food for a flame, meant not to nourish but to hold a shape steady, to persuade soft things to keep their edges. The draught clung to the plaster and grew tacky, and with it came a faint scent like old rain in a cellar, the smell of kept time. Neighbors said the graves kept no animals, and that was true because the house did not feed what houses feed. It fed its own demand. In the curve of the room stood 3 low glass cradles set into the wall like niches, each lidded, each holding fluid the color of melted ice. Nothing floated loose. If one looked too long, one saw the idea of small shapes, not bodies so much as plans for bodies. Eleanor did not lift those lids. Her work was the circle. When the ring was complete, she pressed the latch, and the door nested into itself so fully that a sheet of paper would not slide between wood and frame. She stood with her ear close, not touching, and listened for the tiniest change in the weight of the air. If the draught pleased the house, the hush deepened until the world outside felt thinner, like a picture. If it displeased it, the tremor in the glass cradles would find her teeth. Those nights she remade the mix and walked it again, never letting a drip cross itself, never letting the pour falter. Sometimes the pails held not liquid but cloth. She dunked the muslin in warm water and salt and carried the heavy folds into the room, laying them in the curve so no edge rose. Steam crawled along the wall and she watched it map the space. Afterward, she wrung the cloth until her wrists ached and hung it on a rack in the attic. Salt dried to a pale rim on the floor, and she swept it with a straw brush into a tin that Henry kept locked. On the pantry calendar, small pencil marks fell 7 nights apart. On those evenings, she hummed for 49 seconds by the covered clock, then stopped. The ring dried to a film and flaked under her brush. No scraps went outside. Whatever ate here wanted only what left no trace, and the house obeyed. Before dawn, she stood at the upstairs door until the hush settled. She smoothed the latch and went to the porch. Soon the birthdays would be kept without candles. In Las Piedras, a birthday was usually loud, neighbors bringing pie, cousins turning up without warning, children chasing each other through kitchens until the floor shook. But up on the ridge, the days came and went without a soul invited. The Graves family marked them in ways no one could see from the road, though some swore they could feel it. At dusk, a faint singing would drift down toward the town, single notes drawn so long they seemed to bend the air. The sound never wandered from its pitch, never rushed, never slowed. Those who counted said it always lasted exactly 49 seconds before ending in a silence so complete it made crickets stop. The song was never paired with laughter, never followed by a cheer or the pop of a cork. The house would stand as it always did. Curtains still drawn, porch swept spotless, not a candle flickering through the glass. Inside, Eleanor Graves had her own measure of time. A tall clock stood in the hall, its pendulum stilled and its hands fixed at midnight. She kept her hours with another method, one only she and Henry seemed to understand. When the mark arrived, never a date, but a point only they knew. She lit a single lamp and set it on the floor of the round room. Its light did not spread in the way light should. Without corners to break it, it wrapped the walls in an even, unnatural glow, erasing any sense of depth. Henry would carry in a small wooden box, its lid secured by thin wire. He always placed it in the same spot at the edge of the circle Eleanor had fed the week before. The lid stayed closed. Whatever it contained did not move. Yet the air inside the room would change. It became dense enough to feel on the skin like a slow current of warm water pressing from all sides. Eleanor would hum the single note, and Henry would count in his head. The sound would pass through the house like a thin needle, stitching the rooms together for the span of those 49 seconds. On the 34th second, a faint vibration would shiver along the plaster. By the final note, it would fade, leaving only the steady weight of the air. The lamp would be snuffed, the box would be removed. No trace remained. From the ridge, the few who had heard it swore the note did not feel like music. It was too exact, too measured to belong to joy, more like the tone a craftsman might use to test the resonance of a tool. The old doctor who once delivered a Graves child told his wife that if a sound like that could be made for the living, it could also be made for the dead. The wife told no one, but she never walked the ridge again. As the years passed, the silent birthdays never altered in length or tone. The intervals between them varied, but the ritual never broke. Some nights the wind carried the sound farther, as if the ridge allowed it to escape. Other times it seemed to stop before it reached the first fence post below. A rancher who rode too close once swore that the song did not come from a single point in the house, but from the walls themselves, as though they were singing back to someone inside. He claimed the sound found his bones and stayed there for days, making his hands shake when he tried to eat. No one ever saw a cake brought into the house, no wrapped boxes, no ribbons, and yet the county records continued to mark the passing years for each child whose name was inked in the courthouse ledger. Each time another birthday passed without a child seen in the yard, the neighbors' unease deepened, though no one dared confront the Graves. By the 12th such occasion, some no longer called them birthdays at all, but the nights the ridge listens. Eleanor kept her own counsel about what those nights meant. To her, they were not celebrations, but calibrations, a way to keep something in place, to mark its growth without allowing it to step beyond the boundaries she and Henry had set. Whatever the box held, it was not meant to leave the room. Whatever the song was called, it was not meant to be heard by ears that did not know its purpose. And so the house kept its pact. 49 seconds of sound followed by a silence that no one, not even the wind, dared to break. The peddler came in the late autumn selling sewing needles, oilskin aprons, and jars of patent salve. He had been walking for hours when he reached the ridge, the air sharp with the smell of dry mesquite and cold dust. Henry Graves met him at the gate, his voice measured, his manner polite but tight enough to suggest the visit should be quick. The peddler, used to doorsteps both warm and hostile, made his pitch anyway. Eleanor appeared then, her pale dress without a speck of travel dirt, and asked to see his cloth samples. She led him into the parlor while Henry remained on the porch, sweeping an already spotless rail. The peddler took in the neatness at once. The floors without a single scratch, the curtains drawn so tightly they seemed nailed to the frames. He laid out his bolts of fabric, the colors dull in the lamplight, and watched as Eleanor ran her fingers over each with a care that felt more like inspection than interest. It was while she turned toward a cabinet for her coin purse that his eyes wandered past her to the far wall. There, behind a panel of glass so clear it seemed invisible at first, stood what he thought were cradles, 3 of them side by side, each framed in dark wood but lined with thick gleaming glass from base to hood. They were filled with a fluid as pale as melted wax, a liquid that held no bubbles, no ripple even from the slight tremor of his step. In the nearest cradle, something small rested in the center. He could not tell if it was wrapped in cloth or bare, only that it had a shape too exact to be a bundle of rags. The outline suggested limbs, but they lay too still, too perfectly placed. The peddler's throat tightened as he realized there was no sign of breath, yet the skin, if skin it was, held a faint sheen as if it had been polished. He told himself it was a doll, some private craft, though he had never seen a doll so precisely made, so careful in proportion. In the second cradle, the shape was less defined, as though the contents were still forming themselves. The third appeared empty until the lamplight caught on something just beneath the surface, a pale curve that might have been the arc of a skull or only the reflection of the glass. Eleanor turned back to find him staring. She smiled faintly, though her eyes did not. In that moment, the peddler felt the shift that happens when a hostess becomes a warden. She closed the space between them without hurry, lowering the coins into his palm with a cool weight. Her fingers brushed his wrist, and he felt a sudden, inexplicable heaviness in his arm, as though the blood had thickened. He forced himself to thank her, but the words came out flat. She nodded toward the fabric samples still on her table and asked if he would roll them. He obeyed, though he could feel her watching, measuring not his work but his proximity to the cradles. When he stepped back out into the cold, Henry was at the gate again, still sweeping, though there was nothing left to sweep. The peddler walked quickly down the slope, not daring to look over his shoulder. By the time he reached the road, his breath had steadied, but his mind could not shake the image of those cradles. The liquid had looked heavy, like it would resist movement, yet the shapes within seemed almost suspended, as if neither sinking nor floating. He wondered how such things could be kept so clear, so untouched by the rot or clouding that time brings. In the weeks after, he told no one what he had seen. A traveling man depends on his welcome, and Graves' coin was good. Yet alone at night, he replayed the glimpse in his mind, the way the smallest shape had seemed arranged, as if set for display rather than rest. And behind that, a darker thought pressed at him, that the glass was not meant to protect what lay inside, but to protect everything else from it. Back on the ridge, Eleanor polished the glass in long, slow arcs until not a single streak marred the surface. She checked the fluid for clarity, adjusting the lamp so she could see every inch. When she was satisfied, she lowered the cloth cover over each cradle. The room cooled. The air grew still. The house seemed to hold its breath again, sealing the moment the way the glass sealed its contents. Whatever lay within did not move. It never had to. The work was not to wake them. It was to keep them exactly as they were. The sheriff's notes were never meant for the official record. They were kept in a separate ledger, one without the county seal, hidden behind a false panel in his desk. In them, he described what he found on a cold March morning when he followed a pair of wagon ruts up the ridge and around to the back acre of the Graves property. The snow had melted in strange, perfect ovals, each no more than a yard wide, revealing patches of dark earth that looked undisturbed at first glance. But when he crouched closer, he saw that each patch was, in fact, a shallow pit lined with cloth. The fabric was stitched with looping spirals, tight and even, like the shells of coiled snails. The spirals drew the eye inward, always toward the center, where a small glass tube rested horizontally in a shallow depression. The tubes were capped at both ends, and inside each one was something faint and pale, like frost trapped in the shape of a sigh. He lifted one and held it to the light. There was no liquid, no solid, only a faint swirl that seemed to move when he moved, a shimmer too deliberate to be dust. It was not warm, but it carried the sensation of warmth, the way a room feels after someone has just left. The sheriff realized with a slow dread that these tubes were meant to hold the last breath of something. perhaps an animal, perhaps not. The stitching in the cloth was so precise, so unbroken, it reminded him of surgical sutures. Whoever had made them had done so with hands that never trembled, and with a purpose that did not rush. There were 7 pits in total, each the same size, each aligned in a gentle curve as if part of a larger circle that disappeared under the frozen ground. No tracks led to or from them, as though the snow had chosen not to record those steps. He noticed that the fabric linings were clean, unstained by soil, as though they had been placed after the pits were dug, not before. That detail made him uneasy. It meant the cloth was not meant to protect what was inside from the earth, but to keep the earth from touching what it contained. As he knelt there, a stillness settled over the acre. The wind, which had been cutting at his ears all morning, seemed to die. He could hear his own breathing heavy in the sudden hush. For a moment he imagined he could hear something else, faint and distant, like the memory of a drawn-out note that had ended long before he arrived. It wasn't sound exactly, but a pressure in the air, a reminder of a presence that had been there recently enough to leave an imprint. He did not remove the tubes from the pits. Something in him understood that they were arranged in a way that mattered, that disturbing them would be more than theft. It would be breaking the kind of rule that nothing human had written. He covered the nearest pit with his boot, pressing the cloth back under the snow, and told himself it was to hide what he had found from the wind, not because of the sharp unease that rose in his chest. In his notes he wrote only the facts: 7 pits, cloth linings, spiral stitching, glass tubes with faint internal movement. But in the margin he added a single sentence in smaller handwriting: "The air in them is not dead." He never told the deputy what he meant. The ledger stayed in his desk until his death, after which it was boxed with his other effects and forgotten in the attic of the county building. Back on the ridge, Eleanor and Henry returned to the acre that night. They moved in silence, their boots leaving no marks on the frozen soil. Eleanor knelt by each pit, uncapped the tubes one by one, and leaned close. Whatever she released made no sound, but the frost in the air seemed to shift, as if caught by a breeze that no one else could feel. She recapped the tubes, placed them back in their spirals, and smoothed the cloth. Above them the stars burned cold, and the ridge kept its breath for another year. The rain that carved the ridge open came hard and lasting, a black-bellied storm that turned the arroyo into a blade and planed the hillside until a square of earth fell away from the grave's north wall and showed a mouth that had never been meant for light, a cut edge of plaster and stone leading down into a chamber hidden under the parlor like a second throat, and the air that rose from it felt wrong at once, not foul, not sweet, but held and used, as if it had already been breathed by something that did not waste breath. Men came with lanterns and ropes because disaster gives permission to look, and they peered over the lip and saw a room whose walls were curved like the upstairs dome, every seam erased, the corners erased, the ceiling sloped into a shallow bowl, so even the dim lantern glow spread without shadow and gave the eye no place to rest. Along those walls, on brass pins sunk in precise arcs, hung small frames made of bone, not skeletons, not trophies, but shapes coaxed into patterns the body does not learn on its own. Ribs knitted into lattices, finger joints joined end to end until they made pale chains, tiny vertebrae threaded on fine wire that had long since taken their curve and would not bend back. And at the center of each composition a plate of cartilage pressed flat until it remembered being a circle. Nothing dripped, nothing stank. The room rejected the idea of rot. It was a place where time had been caged and made to move at a measured pace. On the floor, 4 low tables of maple stood on castered feet, their edges rounded, their tops scored with a field of faint grooves that ran in spirals barely deeper than a hair, as if something soft had been turned there the way a machinist turns brass. each pass shallower than the last until the form held itself. There were no tools left out, no jars, no cloths, only a long, shallow tray set into the far wall, glass-faced like a cabinet, and within it pale threads floated in clear gel, threads that caught the lamplight and flashed with a fine grain like fish scales, and the man who leaned close said in a flat voice that they looked like the sutures that fuse the skull, unzipped and taught to live apart. The sheriff went down first because it was his right, though he confessed later to his ledger that the steps swallowed sound and made his boots feel lighter than they were, and when he set his foot on the floor he did not hear the scuff he expected, only a dry, even hush, like a breath drawn and held. He touched a frame with his gloved knuckle and found it warm, not from the storm, not from the lamps, but from the room itself, a steady heat the way stone keeps sun after dusk, and that heat ran up his finger into his wrist like a patient wire. He saw on one table a set of narrow rests and clamps built not to hold a body down, but to hold a curve steady while it became what it had been told to be, and beside that a pair of brass rings set into the surface at child shoulder width, the wood smooth where small arms had once pressed long enough to polish it. On the near wall a faint stain traced the shape of an often wet circle at ankle height, pale and regular, and he thought of Eleanor's poured ring upstairs and felt his stomach lift against his ribs. The men above called to him and their voices flattened at the opening, losing their shape as they entered, and he understood without words that sound itself was another thing this room harvested. The failure of echo, the compliance of breath, the mercy of a cry that could not form. He counted the frames and stopped at 49 because that was the number his mind chose before he could choose otherwise, and at the 40th his hand began to tremble the way Abel's had in the round room. A fine inner shiver that made the lamp flame shudder though no wind moved. On a shelf cut into the curve he found 7 glass tubes identical to those from the back acre, each stoppered, each holding a faint swirling like frost, trying to remember how to be air. And beside them a ledger smaller than Ruth's, but kept in the same patient hand, its pages waterless and clean, each line a date marked between planting and harvest, and a single word repeated in a column that never wavered. Kept. He closed it and did not open it again. When he came up, he told the men to stand back and waited until the pulse in his throat slowed, and Henry, who had said almost nothing, stood with his hands folded as though in church, his eyes on the mud, and when someone asked what the room was for, he answered in a voice that did not rise that it was storage, and the men did not laugh because the word fit in a way that made them colder. Before dusk, the sheriff ordered boards and nails and covered the mouth with planks laid edge to edge so tight a paper could not pass, and he wrote in the official book that flood damage had exposed a root cellar unsafe for entry. But in his private notes he wrote the phrase "the harvest room" and under it a sentence that cost him sleep. What is made here is not born, and what is born here is taught not to be alive. The storm passed, the ground crusted, and the ridge held its breath again. But now the town knew the house had a second heart, and knowing did not help them breathe. The first time the traveling photographer climbed the ridge, he brought a mule, a folding tripod, and a wooden box of glass plates wrapped in old shirts, and he promised Henry a likeness that would outlast storms and even names, and Henry nodded as if agreeing to gravity and led him into the parlor where the curtains stayed shut and the air kept its even weight. And Eleanor stood beside the cold hearth with her hands folded so neatly they looked pinned, her eyes on the wall rather than the lens, and the photographer set his camera, focused until the brass gears would turn no further, and asked for the children to be brought in for a single exposure, nothing more. They came in a line, small and obedient, not fearful, not glad, their faces calm and colorless the way chilled milk looks, and when he told them to keep very still, they did not blink, and when he told them to breathe gently, they did not seem to breathe at all. and he counted under his breath and lifted the cap and held that open darkness for the necessary seconds, and then he closed it and felt relief, the way a diver feels the surface under his hands. He worked the plate and his chemicals on the kitchen table while Eleanor stood with a cloth over the clock and Henry kept the door shut, and he watched as the image rose. The hearth, the lamp, the neat seam of Eleanor's dress, Henry's hand resting flat on the chair back, all of it crisp and obedient. And then the place where the children stood, which did not rise at all in lines but as a tender smear, a blur shaped like faces but refusing edges. And the mouths a single soft sweep without opening, as if the light had tried to enter and been turned away. He said he must try again, perhaps a fault in the plate or in his hands. He cleaned the lens, changed the time, set the lamp closer, moved the children by inches, placed a bright card near their faces to catch a highlight. And still the plate took the room clean and left the children as fog arranged by rules he could not see. He left with his payment and told himself dust and haste had tricked him and promised to return with better glass. He came back the next summer with newer plates and asked to open the curtains, and Henry said no, and asked to bring the lamp closer, and Eleanor said yes. And he focused again until the focus would go no further, and the exposure felt as long as illness, and the house did not creak. And when the picture came up, the children were again a measured haze, not random, not motion, but built from tiny repeating arcs that curled where eyes should be and drew shut where a mouth might part, as if the emulsion had recorded a lesson rather than a person. On his third visit, he learned to look for absence. He set the parents on either side of an empty chair, meaning to capture a space where a child should sit. And when he fixed the image, the chair sat clear, the hearth clear, Eleanor's dress clear, and over the empty seat a faint veil, the suggestion of a small face turned down, the mouth a closed line, which left him colder than failure because it meant the plate had found something and then refused to name it. He asked gently if any were ill, and Eleanor said they were kept, and he did not ask how they were kept how. He carried one wrapped plate away because Henry insisted it was theirs to keep, and on the road he unwrapped it to look, and in the afternoon heat the glass grew warm in his hands and the haze seemed to thicken, and he wrapped it again because the feeling was like holding breath that was not his. Years later, when the flood cut open the wall and the sheriff walked the harvest room, a deputy found that same plate under a folded quilt in the attic. The emulsion yellowed, but the refusal intact. The adults stood crisp and calm, and where the children belonged, the rule of blur held. And if one leaned near, one could see the arcs that matched the spiral stitches from the back acre. Small curves teaching the mouth to stay sealed even in light. The sheriff kept the plate in his desk for a season and took it out on careful nights. And he wrote in the private ledger that the picture showed not failure but training. And he crossed that out and wrote it again. And he remembered that no one in Las Piedras had ever heard a Graves child cry. Not at birth, not in fever, not in play. And he thought of tubes that held last breaths and rooms built to erase corners and the way 49 seconds of song could tune a space, and the idea came to him that a cry can be taught not to form, the way a hand can be taught not to shake. And he closed the ledger and put the plate away and did not sleep. By the time the photographer died, his mule sold and most plates broken, the town had learned to live with the knowledge that the Graves children came clear only where clarity failed. The proof of them was paper and silence shaped by rule, and a smear that followed orders, and the ridge went on holding its air, and the house went on keeping what mouths would not release. And the camera, honest as glass can be, told the same soft lie every time because the children who never cried had learned how to be seen without being taken. September came with a dry wind that skinned the hills and made the mesquite click like teeth. And on a Monday morning the ridge felt wrong in a way no one could name. Not louder, not softer. just a held second between heartbeats as if waiting for a command that did not arrive. The milk boy reached the grave's gate and found the latch set with its tidy loop. The porch swept to a blank shine that returned only his own dusty steps, and the knob under his palm felt cool in the heat, the kind of cool that belongs to cellars and church stone. The sheriff forced the lock because the town accepts force when quiet grows too neat, and the parlor air that slid out was level and used, the curtains sealed, the clock hooded, the hearth clean enough to shame a Sunday. On the table sat two plates set opposite, knives and forks aligned with the measured care of a surveyor, and on each plate lay a small portion of roast, pale and dry, edges stiff as paper, as if the heat had been allowed to touch it and then told to stop. Beside one plate, a napkin rested in a perfect triangle. Beside the other, the fold had the shallow dent of a thumb that had pressed but not wiped. There were chairs, but no scrape marks, no crumbs, no spills, no haste. Upstairs, the round room waited with its even light, the door sealing behind each man who tested it, the air pressing soft against their cheeks the way water does when a swimmer looks up from the bottom of a pond. The poured channel along the cove held a thin film that had dried to a glassy skin, unbroken, a ring that reflected the lamp without a tremor. The three built-in cradles were capped beneath their covers, cloth drawn smooth, corners stitched with that small, spiral hand. No lamp turned smoky, no draught cut the flame. In the bedroom, dresses hung at exact intervals with a breath of space between each sleeve, a faint trace of lemon oil rising when the wardrobe opened and closed, and the bed was made with the kind of care that admits no sleep has yet sat on it. Shoes waited with their toes aligned to the board seam, laces tucked, soles clean. On Henry's dresser lay 3 coins, each faced the same way, and under them an envelope that held nothing. In the cellar, the harvest room remained hidden by boards the sheriff himself had ordered, and he stared at the seam and felt the old ache in his jaw that storms and lies had given him. And he told himself he would not open it again because he had already learned what knowing does. The back acre offered only the slow thaw of its 7 shallow pits, cloth dry, glass tubes absent, spiral stitches empty and patient as a spider's work after a fly has been taken. The neighbors gathered at the fence and tried to read the yard like a page, but the yard offered only blank lines. No wheel ruts, no mule droppings, no prints, as if the ground had been pressed and smoothed by a wide palm in the night. The wind climbed the ridge and quieted there, meeting the house's old rule and obeying it. If the graves had left, they had left with nothing that made noise. The sheriff walked the rooms and counted what should have been out of place and found nothing. A woman does not leave without a stray pin on a sill. There was no pin. A man does not go far without a coat thrown once over his shoulder. There was no coat missing. The well bucket was half raised and half lowered, the rope coiled as if it had taught itself to rest. 49 seconds of song had not been heard for 3 weeks, a teacher in town said later, because she marked her nights with her own grief and would have known if any note had tried her window. The sheriff listed names in his official book and wrote the word absent next to each. Then closed it and stood in the round room and whispered to himself that the house kept air like a ledger keeps marks, and he felt foolish and right in the same moment. The town waited for a letter that did not come, for a wagon spotted in the next county that did not appear, for a body at the base of the ridge that did not rise out of the brush. Days stretched and did not break. A carpenter said a room without corners teaches you to forget where to look, and the sheriff believed that now, because he could not find a place for his eyes to land and call finished. He took one last walk through the kitchen and found a damp ring on the counter where a pail had once sat, and he placed his finger in it and felt nothing except the sense that something had been completed and lifted away. Before the week was over, he ordered the windows boarded and the doors braced, men glad for work that asked only for nails and measured cuts. And when the final board seated and the last hammer fell, the silence that rose from inside had the weight of a closed eye. He hung a notice that used plain words about safety and hazard and wrote the date in the corner and locked the gate. And the ridge kept its breath the way it always had. Only now there was no one to measure it, and the town learned a new rule. Some absences behave like rooms, and once you enter them, you come out changed. In the summer of 1957, when the county decided to reclaim the ridge for grazing land, the first order of business was to strip the boards from the Graves house. The men sent up to do it had no connection to the family, no memories of the song that once rolled down the slope, no knowledge of the names in the courthouse ledger. They thought of it as any other job: pry, pull, stack, burn. The boards came away cleanly, the nails coming out without squeal, as though the wood had been waiting for this exact moment to let go. Dust did not billow. The air inside moved slow and heavy, not rushing out like a space abandoned, but rolling forward in a steady wave, warm against the face, as if the house had been keeping something alive. The parlor stood as it had been left 45 years earlier. The plates on the table were gone, but the cloth triangles remained pressed flat. The curtains still hung, their edges without fray, their folds too sharp for fabric so old. The clock stood hooded, the hands frozen in place. Upstairs, the round room was unchanged. The channel along the base still traced its perfect circle, faintly glazed as if the last pour had dried only days ago. The air in that room carried a low pressure, not enough to pain the ears, but enough to make the chest aware of each breath taken and held. It was in the hall off the parlor that they found the door they did not expect. It had been paneled over in the same wood as the wall, the seam invisible until the crowbar rang against it differently than against the rest. They pried it open and revealed narrow steps curling downward, each step edged in a strange, glass-like finish. The deeper they went, the cooler the air became, though it was a summer afternoon. The harvest room had been waiting. The walls still curved into their shallow dome, still free of shadow. The frames of bone hung in their precise arcs, the patterns neither warped nor brittle, the cartilage plates at their centers smooth as ivory. The brass pins that held them gleamed as if polished. On the tables nothing stirred, yet the spirals carved into their surfaces caught the lamplight and drew the eyes inward until the men stepped back to break their focus. And then they saw the cases. Glass lined the far wall from floor to ceiling, divided into narrow vertical compartments, each about the height of a small child. Inside, in the pale suspension of some unaging fluid, were forms that could not be mistaken for anything else. Not skeletons, not dolls, not bodies as the grave knows them, but bodies as they might appear if they had never finished the act of becoming. Skin smooth and unwrinkled, hair fine and too evenly placed, eyes closed without tension. Each chest rose slowly, impossibly, one breath every few minutes, as if caught between life and whatever comes after it. They were untouched by dust or decay. One man, braver or less patient than the rest, placed his hand against the glass. The form inside shifted. Not a twitch, not a startle, but a slow adjustment, as if making space for him. He jerked his hand back, leaving no print, and stepped away without a word. Another noticed small tubes leading from each case into the wall, disappearing into the plaster. Their purpose was not guessed aloud. The sheriff, now a different man from the one who had boarded the place in 1912, wrote in his official report that the room contained anomalous preservation cases and organic material of unknown composition. In his private notes, he wrote something shorter. They are kept, and they are keeping. The county ordered the house cleared. But in the weeks before the removal crew came, the ridge saw visitors. Not locals, but men in plain suits and narrow ties carrying leather cases that clicked open and shut without revealing much. They walked through each room, lingered in the round room, descended to the harvest room, and emerged hours later without speaking to anyone. Whatever they decided, they did not take the cases away. When the removal crew arrived, the glass was empty. The fluid was gone. Only the brass pins and the bone frames remained. The house was burned under official order that autumn. From the town, the column of smoke rose white at first, then gray, then a color none of the witnesses could agree on. Sweet-smelling, they all agreed. Too sweet for wood. No one went close enough to watch the roof fall. By the time the last embers were shoveled into tin and scattered in the arroyo, the ridge looked as though nothing had ever stood there. But the air on that hill never moved quite right again. Wind slowed there and sound thinned, as if the ground still remembered the pact it had kept for decades. And though the house was gone, the townspeople swore that some nights in late summer they could still hear it. A single note held for 49 seconds, ending in a silence that felt not empty but full. When the house was ash and the ridge held only its quiet, the story did not end. It seeped into paper and office light and the slow hands of clerks who signed their names to new rules that were meant to keep what had happened from happening again. And yet each signature felt like a bandage pressed to a wound that had already learned to heal without a mark. The county sealed the private ledgers into archival boxes and set them on shelves that smelled of paste and cardboard, and a commission convened in a room with high windows to decide what to call the thing that had lived on the ridge. They settled on institutional failure because evil was a word that made the air feel too close, and because institutional failure could be corrected with policy. So policy came. Tighter oversight of births and deaths, surprise inspections of midwives' practices, laws requiring the presence of a second witness at every recorded birth, and a statute that said any home with sealed rooms must be reported and investigated. And the sheriff, who had once counted bone frames with his hands shaking, stood at the back of that room and listened as strangers spoke in careful tones about reporting thresholds and compliance. And he thought of the poured ring upstairs and the 7 pits on the acre and the glass that showed children as smears. And he understood why the commissions always sounded clean. They spoke for the living, and what had been kept was not done with the living. A memorial went up on the courthouse lawn on an afternoon so hot the shadows looked carved. It was a low stone with no names, only a single engraved line. For the registered lost, and people passing touched the stone without looking like a person presses the edge of a table while thinking of something else. Because grief for a thing one never touched is thin and stubborn, and it does not rise until night. In the years after the fire, a man from the state unsealed a folder that carried a plain paper clip and the smell of old air. And inside he found a letter from a physician who had once been paid in gold to call at the ridge. And the letter did not confess to murder or to miracle, only to a habit learned in a house where corners were erased. He wrote that he had taught his hands to move softly around a breath that did not want to be born, and that he had believed this was mercy the way a craftsman believes a perfectly made joint is good. And if he was wrong, he wanted the record to carry his wrongness like a bruise. And the man from the state made a note in the margin that said referred for review, and then closed the folder because the air in the room had turned used. School children read the plaque on the lawn and asked their teachers who the lost were. And the teacher said the words registered at birth but never seen in school, and left the rest to the quiet that follows when a mouth knows it cannot explain a thing without waking something heavy. Reporters came with cameras and soft voices and filmed the ridge at sunset, the shot lingering on the place where the house had stood as if the ground itself might speak. And their work ran on television between segments about rain in distant counties and the price of feed, and people watched and said to each other that it was sad, And then they cooked supper and checked the doors, and the air in their kitchens felt normal because the ridge was far. But some took the story into their sleep and woke with the sense that a breath had been held in the dark and that they had obeyed it. From time to time, a box would surface, in an attic, a cellar, the back of a dead lawyer's cabinet, holding one more piece of the ridge, a ledger with the word kept written 50 times, a slip of cloth stitched in a spiral with thread so fine the line looked like hair. A photograph of Eleanor standing beside a hooded clock with her hands folded, her gaze not on the lens but on the wall where a child should have been. And each time an official would sign a receipt and note the chain of custody. And each time the item would enter a climate-controlled space where silence is a rule, and the people who kept those rooms would breathe more slowly when they worked. Because even in the clean hum of the archive, a person can feel watched by what is not there. In the end, the legacy was not only the policies in the stone, it was the change in the way Las Piedras listened at night. After the burning, the wind still slid off the ridge in a thin sheet, but now when crickets paused, there was a thought that crossed the porch rails like a shadow. Evil does not always come shouting or wearing teeth. It comes as tidy hands and regular hours and the patient voice of someone who says kept the way a baker says proofed, as if a human being were a kind of dough. The town learned that silence is not empty, it is a tool, and in skilled hands it can hold a shape the way glass holds a breath. They taught their children to speak when they were hurt and to cry when they were born and to tell a neighbor when a house made them uneasy. And they wrote those lessons on paper and in law, but they also understood, the way you understand heat on your skin without needing to name it, that rules do not stop people who worship order more than life. So they visit the stone and bring flowers and stand long enough to feel foolish and then less foolish, and some nights late, a single note runs along the hill for 49 seconds, and the people who hear it do not say so aloud because naming a thing sometimes invites it in, and because the note feels less like a haunting than a test. Are you still listening? Will you look away if the signature is perfect? Will you call a kept thing safe because keeping is easier than undoing? The reel ends with the ridge dark and the town lit in folded lines, and the voice that carries the story lowers and asks the only honest question there is in places like this. What do you think? Could this happen again? And if it did, would we notice before the silence finished its work?